My name is Harmony Mitchell, and I'm 28 years old. On Christmas Eve, while hanging ornaments on my tree, my phone rang at 11:43 p.m. with news that would shatter my world forever. Miss Mitchell, I'm calling from St. Mary's Hospital. Your mother Catherine passed away at 3:47 a.m. this morning. I'm so sorry for your loss. My hands trembled as the nurse's words echoed through my apartment. But what came next made my blood run cold. My father Gerald's voice in the background, eerily calm, almost relieved, saying he'd been home sleeping and couldn't make it in time to say goodbye. Where are you watching this story from tonight? If you're ready to dive into a tale of family betrayal that will leave you questioning everything, please hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories. Because what I discovered about my father's lies that Christmas morning would lead me down a rabbit hole of deception, murder, and a conspiracy that reached far deeper than I ever imagined. Let's begin this journey together. Growing up, I always knew something was different about my family dynamics. My mother Catherine was the warmth in our house, the one who made holidays magical and bandaged scraped knees with infinite patience. My father Gerald, however, was a different story entirely. Cold, calculating, always working angles and measuring people's usefulness to him. But I never imagined the depths of his manipulation until that terrible phone call changed everything. 3 weeks before Christmas, my mother had started complaining of severe stomach pains. What began as what she thought was food poisoning quickly escalated into something far more serious. She was losing weight rapidly, couldn't keep food down, and had developed a pallor that frightened me whenever I saw her. When she was finally admitted to St. Mary's Hospital, I expected my father to be by her side constantly. Instead, he seemed almost annoyed by the inconvenience. Every time I tried to visit my mother, Gerald had some excuse ready. She's sleeping, Harmony. The doctors say she needs rest. Or visiting hours are restricted today because of her condition. Or my personal favorite, she specifically asked not to see anyone right now because she doesn't want people to see her looking so weak. That last one should have been my first major red flag, because my mother had never been vain about her appearance, especially not with her own daughter. I started calling the hospital directly, trying to get updates on her condition, but somehow my father had managed to get himself listed as the primary contact for all medical decisions. The nurses were polite but firm that they could only discuss her care with Gerald. When I pressed them for details, they would redirect me to speak with my father. It felt like I was being deliberately kept away from my own mother, but I couldn't prove anything concrete. The breakthrough came 3 days before Christmas when I decided to show up at the hospital unannounced. I figured if I could just walk into her room, Gerald couldn't stop me from seeing her. But when I arrived at the nurse's station, something interesting happened. Nurse Jennifer Williams, a kind woman in her 50s who had been caring for my mother, looked genuinely surprised to see me. "Oh, Miss Mitchell. I didn't expect to see you here. Your father said you were out of town for the holidays and wouldn't be visiting." My stomach dropped. I had never told my father I was going anywhere for Christmas. In fact, I had specifically told him I would be staying local to be close to Mom. When I explained this to Nurse Williams, her expression shifted to concern, then confusion. "That's very strange," she admitted, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "He's been very specific about limiting your mother's visitors. He said the family had agreed it was best for her recovery." She paused, then leaned closer. "Between you and me, your mother has been asking about you constantly. She seems confused about why you haven't been to see her." My heart broke imagining my mother wondering where I was while she was sick and scared. But Nurse Williams gave me more than just guilt that day. She also provided my first concrete evidence that my father was lying. "I saw your father leaving the hospital around 2:30 this morning," she mentioned casually. "He looked upset, almost angry. I assumed there had been some bad news about your mother's test results." 2:30 in the morning. That was just over an hour before my mother died. Gerald had told me he was home sleeping, that he couldn't make it to the hospital in time when the nurses called. But if Nurse Williams saw him leaving at 2:30, that meant he had been there. He had been with my mother, or at least at the hospital, right before she died. And then he left. He left her alone to die. When I confronted him about this discrepancy later that evening, Gerald's reaction was telling. Instead of surprise or confusion, he became immediately defensive and aggressive. "That nurse is mistaken," he snapped. "I was home all night. You're grieving, Harmony, and you're not thinking clearly. Maybe you should consider talking to someone professional about these paranoid thoughts." But I wasn't paranoid, and I wasn't confused. I was determined. The next morning, I drove to the hospital and asked to speak with someone about the security footage from the parking garage. The security guard, an elderly man named Frank who had worked there for 15 years, was sympathetic to my situation. When I explained that I needed to verify what time my father had left the hospital, he pulled up the footage without hesitation. There it was, clear as day. Gerald's silver Mercedes leaving the parking garage at exactly 2:28 a.m. on Christmas morning. The timestamp was unmistakable. He had lied to me, to the police, to everyone about where he was when my mother died. The question that haunted me as I sat in my car staring at that timestamp was simple but terrifying. If he was willing to lie about being there, what else was he hiding about my mother's death? That night, I called Dr. Samantha Brooks, my mother's attending physician, and requested a meeting. Dr. Brooks was a sharp, professional woman in her early 40s who had always struck me as someone who cared deeply about her patients. When we met in her office the following day, I could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of something heavy she was carrying. "Your mother's case has been troubling me," she admitted after I explained my concerns about my father's behavior. "There were some decisions made regarding her care that I questioned, but your father had power of attorney and was very insistent about the treatment plan." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I've been practicing medicine for 18 years, and I've learned to trust my instincts about families. Something felt wrong about the dynamics between your parents, especially in those final days." Dr. Brooks couldn't give me specific details about my mother's medical treatment due to privacy laws, but she could confirm that Gerald had made several unusual requests regarding her care. He had refused certain diagnostic tests that she had recommended, insisted on limiting the medical staff who had access to my mother, and had been adamant that no autopsy be performed after her death. As I left the hospital that evening, I felt the weight of terrible knowledge settling on my shoulders. My father hadn't just been distant or uncaring during my mother's illness. He had been actively controlling every aspect of her medical care, isolating her from family and friends, and lying about his whereabouts when she died. I didn't have proof of anything criminal yet, but every instinct I had was screaming that my mother's death hadn't been natural. And my father was at the center of it all. The most chilling realization came as I was driving home. If Gerald could lie so easily about something as basic as where he was when his wife died, what other lies had he been telling? How long had this manipulation been going on? And most terrifying of all, if he had somehow caused my mother's death, what would he do to me if he discovered I was investigating him? The day after New Year's, I made the decision that would change everything. I was going to get copies of my mother's complete medical records, regardless of what obstacles my father had put in place. As her daughter, I had certain rights, and I was prepared to fight for them if necessary. What I discovered in those records would prove that my suspicions were not only justified but that the conspiracy surrounding my mother's death went far deeper than just my father's lies. Armed with legal documentation proving my relationship to my mother, I returned to St. Mary's Hospital and requested her complete medical file. The administrative staff seemed nervous about my request, making several phone calls and consulting with supervisors before finally agreeing to provide the records. The delay itself was suspicious, but what I found when I finally reviewed those documents was absolutely damning. According to the medical timeline, my mother had been admitted with severe gastric distress and dehydration. Standard protocol would have been to run comprehensive blood work, toxicology screening, and imaging studies to determine the cause of her symptoms. But Gerald had refused the toxicology screening, claiming it was unnecessary and expensive. He had also limited the blood work to basic panels only, despite Dr. Brooks' recommendations for more extensive testing. Even more troubling were the medication logs. My mother had been prescribed a standard regimen of 4 fluids, anti-nausea medication, and pain management. But there were several entries for additional medications that had been administered at Gerald's specific request. These weren't prescribed by Dr. Brooks or any other physician on record. The nurse's notes indicated that Gerald had claimed these were supplements that my mother's previous doctor had recommended, though no such doctor was listed anywhere in her medical history. When I researched the medications that Gerald had provided, I discovered they were not available over the counter. One was a powerful sedative typically used in surgical procedures, and another was a medication that could cause dangerous interactions with the heart medication my mother had been taking for years. Any qualified medical professional would have known these drugs could be potentially fatal when combined, especially in someone with my mother's health history. I needed answers, and I needed them from Dr. Brooks. When I called to schedule another appointment, I was told that Dr. Brooks was no longer seeing patients and had taken an indefinite leave of absence. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. I managed to get her personal phone number from a sympathetic nurse, and when I reached her at home, her voice was shaky and fearful. "I can't talk to you about your mother's case anymore, Harmony," she said immediately. I'd been advised by the hospital's legal department to refer all questions to administration. But there was something in her tone that told me she wanted to help, that she was being silenced rather than choosing to stay quiet. I pressed her gently, appealing to her conscience as a doctor who had cared about my mother. "There's a coffee shop on Maple Street called the Daily Grind," she finally whispered. "Meet me there tomorrow at 7 in the morning. Come alone, and don't tell anyone where you're going." The line went dead, leaving me with a mixture of hope and terror about what she might reveal. The next morning, Dr. Brooks looked like a woman carrying the weight of the world. Her hands shook as she wrapped them around her coffee cup, and she kept glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to burst in and stop our conversation. What she told me that morning would haunt my dreams for months to come. "Your father didn't just refuse standard medical care for your mother," she began quietly. "He actively interfered with her treatment in ways that put her life in danger. When I tried to override some of his decisions, I was called into a meeting with hospital administrator Frank Morrison. Morrison made it very clear that your father had significant influence with the hospital board and that my concerns were unwelcome. Dr. Brooks explained that Gerald had been making substantial donations to the hospital for years, serving on committees, and had developed personal relationships with key administrators. This gave him leverage that most family members would never have, allowing him to make medical decisions that would normally be questioned or refused. But there was more to the story that made my blood run cold. On your mother's final night, your father brought what he claimed were herbal supplements that she had been taking at home, Dr. Brooks continued. I advised against administering anything that hadn't been approved by the pharmacy, but Morrison overruled me. He said the hospital had a policy of honoring patient preferences for alternative treatments, especially when family members vouched for their safety. The herbal supplements had been administered to my mother just hours before her death. Dr. Brooks had documented her objections in the medical record, but her concerns had been dismissed by hospital administration. When my mother's condition deteriorated rapidly after receiving these unknown substances, Dr. Brooks had called for emergency intervention, but it was too late. "I've never seen anything like what happened to your mother that night," she said, tears forming in her eyes. Her heart rate became erratic, her blood pressure spiked, and then crashed. "It was like watching someone being poisoned, but I had no proof, and your father was there claiming she had always had heart problems." When I suggested we needed to run emergency toxicology, Morrison appeared and said it would be inappropriate to subject the family to unnecessary procedures during their time of grief. The final piece of Dr. Brooks' revelation was the most devastating. After my mother died, Gerald had immediately requested that her body be released to a specific funeral home that he had apparently prearranged. This funeral home had a reputation for quick cremations and minimal questions. By the time Dr. Brooks realized the significance of this arrangement, my mother's body had already been cremated, eliminating any possibility of an independent autopsy. "I've been a doctor for almost 20 years, Dr. Brooks told me as we prepared to leave the coffee shop. "I've seen natural death, accidental death, and yes, I've seen murder disguised as medical emergency." "Your mother was murdered, Harmony. I can't prove it in court, but I know it in my heart. And your father orchestrated every detail to make sure no one could ever prove what really happened." As I drove home that morning, I realized that I was no longer dealing with just my father's lies and manipulation. There was an entire institutional cover-up involving hospital administration, corrupted medical procedures, and a deliberate destruction of evidence. Frank Morrison wasn't just protecting my father, he was an active participant in covering up my mother's murder. But Dr. Brooks had given me more than just terrible knowledge. She had also given me hope. Before we parted, she handed me a small flash drive. "I made copies of everything I could before they restricted my access to your mother's records," she explained. "It's not enough for criminal prosecution, but it might be enough to start asking the right questions. Be careful, Harmony. If they killed your mother to silence her, they won't hesitate to harm you if you get too close to the truth." That afternoon, I made a decision that would put me in direct conflict with my father and everyone protecting him. I was going to investigate my mother's death myself, following every lead and exposing every lie, no matter what the personal cost. My mother had died alone and afraid, abandoned by the people who should have protected her. I owed it to her memory to fight for justice, even if I had to fight the entire system to get it. The war for my mother's truth was just beginning, and I was about to discover that my father's web of deception reached much further than I had ever imagined. 3 weeks into my investigation, I realized that understanding my father's motive for murdering my mother would require digging into places I had never wanted to look. The Gerald Mitchell I thought I knew was about to be revealed as someone far more dangerous and desperate than I had ever imagined. What I discovered about his financial situation would provide the missing piece of the puzzle and show me just how far he had been willing to go to solve his problems. I hired a private investigator named Marcus Thompson, a former police detective who specialized in financial crimes and insurance fraud. Marcus was expensive, but he came highly recommended for his ability to uncover hidden assets, secret debts, and financial motivations for suspicious deaths. When I explained my situation, his expression grew grim in a way that told me he had seen similar cases before. "Family members who kill for money usually have 3 common characteristics," Marcus explained during our first meeting. "They're facing financial ruin, they're running out of time to solve their problems through legitimate means, and they have access to their victim in a way that allows them to control the circumstances of death. Your father appears to check all 3 boxes." Marcus began his investigation by examining my father's business records, bank accounts, and credit history. What he found was a man living a carefully constructed lie. On the surface, Gerald appeared successful with his consulting business, comfortable home, and expensive car. But beneath that facade was a mountain of debt that threatened to destroy everything he had built. The gambling debts were the first shock. Gerald had been making regular trips to casinos in Atlantic City, often losing thousands of dollars in single nights. His credit cards were maxed out, and he had taken several high-interest loans from companies that Marcus recognized as fronts for loan sharks. The total amount owed was staggering, over $200,000, with interest rates that meant the debt was growing faster than Gerald could possibly pay it off through legitimate means. But the gambling was just the beginning. Marcus discovered that Gerald had been embezzling money from his business clients for over 2 years, using a sophisticated system of false invoices and diverted payments. He had stolen nearly $150,000, and his clients were beginning to ask questions about missing funds. It was only a matter of time before his theft was discovered, which would mean criminal charges, professional ruin, and certain prison time. The most damning discovery came when Marcus traced my parents' joint financial accounts and discovered that my mother had been secretly planning to leave Gerald. She had been working with an attorney named Lisa Chen to protect her assets in preparation for a divorce. This was information that had been completely hidden from me, but it explained so much about the tension I had sensed between my parents in the months before her death. When I met with Lisa Chen at her law office, she painted a picture of my mother that broke my heart and filled me with rage simultaneously. Catherine had discovered Gerald's gambling and theft, and she had been gathering evidence to protect herself financially when she filed for divorce. She had been terrified of how Gerald would react when he learned that she knew about his crimes. "Your mother was planning to file for divorce the week after Christmas," Lisa revealed. She had documented evidence of Gerald's gambling, his theft from business clients, and his affairs with multiple women. She was going to take half of all marital assets and would have had grounds to claim additional compensation due to his criminal behavior. Gerald would have lost everything: his house, his business, his reputation, and his freedom. Lisa showed me copies of documents that my mother had been secretly gathering for months. Bank statements showing Gerald's gambling losses, photographs of him entering casinos when he had told her he was working, and even private investigator reports documenting his affairs. My mother had been building an airtight case that would have destroyed Gerald financially and legally. But there was one more piece of evidence that made Gerald's motive for murder absolutely clear. Lisa handed me copies of life insurance policies that Gerald had purchased on my mother's life in the months before her death. The total value was $850,000, more than enough to pay off all of his debts and start over with a clean slate. The policies had been purchased through different companies, apparently to avoid triggering any oversight that might have questioned such large amounts. "Your mother discovered these policies just 2 weeks before she became ill," Lisa explained. "She was terrified because she realized that Gerald had more to gain from her death than from her life. We had discussed her concerns about her safety, and I had advised her to consider staying somewhere safe until the divorce could be finalized. She planned to leave him immediately after Christmas, but she never got the chance." The timeline was damning. Gerald faced financial ruin, criminal prosecution, and public humiliation if my mother's divorce proceeded. But her death would solve all of his problems instantly. He would inherit her share of their assets, collect nearly $1 million in life insurance, and eliminate the only witness to his criminal activities. From his perspective, murdering my mother was not just profitable, it was necessary for his survival. Marcus had also uncovered evidence of Gerald's connections to people who could help him carry out his plan. Through his gambling activities, he had developed relationships with individuals involved in illegal activities, including a man named Vincent Torelli who specialized in making problems disappear. Phone records showed multiple calls between Gerald and Torelli in the weeks before my mother's death, though the content of those conversations was not available. But perhaps the most heartbreaking discovery was evidence that my mother had tried to warn me about her fears. Lisa showed me copies of emails that Catherine had drafted to me, describing her concerns about Gerald and her plans to leave him. The emails had never been sent because Gerald had been monitoring her computer and email accounts. He had known about her plans, her evidence gathering, and her attempts to reach out for help. "Your mother was trapped," Lisa said sadly. Gerald had been systematically isolating her from friends and family, monitoring her communications, and controlling her access to money. When she finally found the courage to fight back, he realized that killing her was his only option to avoid losing everything. As I left Lisa's office that evening, I felt the full weight of my mother's final weeks settling on me. She had been alone, scared, and desperate to escape a man who was planning to kill her. She had tried to gather evidence, tried to protect herself, and tried to reach out for help. But Gerald had been one step ahead of her, controlling every aspect of her life until he could arrange her death in a way that would look natural and leave him as the grieving widower collecting insurance money. But Gerald had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated his daughter's determination to uncover the truth. Now I had motive, means, and opportunity documented. I had financial records, legal documents, and witness testimony that painted a clear picture of premeditated murder. What I still needed was proof of how Gerald had actually killed my mother, and evidence that would stand up in criminal court. The next phase of my investigation would take me into even darker territory, but I was no longer the naive daughter who had trusted her father's lies. I was a woman with a mission, armed with dangerous knowledge and determined to see justice for my mother's murder. Gerald thought he had committed the perfect crime, but he was about to learn that some secrets are impossible to keep buried forever. Armed with the devastating financial evidence that Marcus Thompson had uncovered, I knew I needed to focus on the actual method Gerald had used to kill my mother. The mysterious medications he had brought to the hospital, combined with Dr. Brooks' observations about my mother's final hours, pointed toward poisoning as the most likely cause of death. But proving it would require me to become an amateur toxicologist and uncover evidence that powerful people were determined to keep hidden. I started by researching the medications that had been listed in my mother's medical records as supplements provided by Gerald. Using medical databases and pharmaceutical references, I discovered that the combination of drugs Gerald had brought to the hospital would have been lethal when mixed with my mother's existing heart medication. The interaction would have caused exactly the symptoms that Dr. Brooks had described: irregular heart rate, blood pressure spikes, and eventually cardiac arrest. But understanding how the poisoning worked was different from proving it had actually happened. I needed to find out where Gerald had obtained these prescription medications and whether he had left any trail of evidence. This investigation led me to one of the most disturbing discoveries of my entire journey. Gerald's connection to the hospital extended far beyond his donations and board relationships. Through Marcus's continued investigation, I learned that Gerald had been having an affair with a pharmacy technician at St. Mary's Hospital named Angela Torres. Angela had access to controlled substances and the knowledge to understand how different medications would interact. Phone records showed frequent communication between Gerald and Angela in the months leading up to my mother's death, with a particularly high volume of calls in the 2 weeks before Catherine became ill. When Marcus approached Angela for an interview, her reaction was immediate and telling. She refused to speak with him, became visibly agitated when my mother's death was mentioned, and immediately contacted hospital administration to report that she was being harassed. Her defensive response suggested that she knew far more about my mother's death than she was willing to admit. But Angela wasn't the only hospital employee who appeared to be involved in the cover-up. Dr. Brooks had mentioned Frank Morrison, the hospital administrator who had overruled her medical objections and facilitated Gerald's access to my mother's care. When I researched Morrison's background, I discovered a pattern of ethical violations and questionable decisions that suggested he was willing to compromise patient safety for the right price. Morrison had been disciplined twice in the previous 5 years for accepting inappropriate gifts from pharmaceutical companies and for approving treatment plans that other medical professionals had questioned. He had also been involved in several cases where families had complained about inadequate care or suspicious circumstances surrounding patient deaths. Yet somehow, Morrison had not only kept his job but had been promoted to a position with even more authority over hospital operations. The connection between Morrison and my father went back several years. Gerald had served on hospital fundraising committees, had made substantial donations to Morrison's pet projects, and had even provided consulting services to the hospital administration. This relationship had given Gerald unprecedented access to hospital facilities, staff, and procedures. It also meant that when Gerald needed help covering up my mother's murder, he knew exactly who to approach. My investigation took a dangerous turn when I attempted to interview other hospital staff who had been involved in my mother's care. Most refused to speak with me at all, citing hospital policy and legal concerns. But a few were willing to talk off the record, and their revelations were terrifying. They described a culture of fear at St. Mary's Hospital, where questioning Morrison's decisions could result in immediate termination, bad references, and difficulty finding employment elsewhere in the medical field. One nurse, speaking anonymously, told me that several staff members had been concerned about the circumstances surrounding my mother's death, but that Morrison had made it clear that discussing the case with anyone outside the hospital would be grounds for immediate firing and possible legal action. The nurse also revealed that Angela Torres had been overheard crying in the pharmacy after my mother's death, saying repeatedly that this wasn't supposed to happen. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. While going through my mother's personal effects, which Gerald had packed away in the basement, I discovered a small diary that she had been keeping in the weeks before her death. The entries documented her growing fears about Gerald's behavior, her discovery of his financial crimes, and most importantly, her suspicions about substances he had been giving her at home. According to my mother's diary, Gerald had been bringing her special teas and supplements for several weeks before she was hospitalized, claiming they would help with stress and improve her sleep. At first, Catherine had appreciated the gesture, thinking it showed that Gerald was concerned about her health. But she had gradually noticed that these substances made her feel disoriented, nauseous, and increasingly unwell. In her final diary entry, written just 3 days before she was admitted to the hospital, my mother wrote, "I'm becoming suspicious of the things Gerald brings me to drink. They taste bitter, and I always feel worse after taking them. Yesterday, I pretended to drink the tea but poured it out when he wasn't looking. I felt much better that day. I'm afraid Gerald might be trying to make me sick, but I don't understand why. I need to find a way to test these substances without him knowing." The diary entry was devastating because it showed that my mother had realized Gerald was poisoning her, but she had run out of time to prove it or protect herself. It also suggested that Gerald had been practicing his poisoning technique at home before implementing the final, lethal dose at the hospital. He had been slowly weakening my mother's health to make her eventual death appear more natural and less suspicious. I took the diary to Marcus, who arranged for the remaining tea containers that my mother had hidden in her bedroom to be tested by an independent laboratory. The results confirmed our worst fears. The tea contained traces of the same medications that had been administered to my mother at the hospital, along with other substances that would have gradually damaged her digestive system and weakened her immune response. Gerald had been systematically poisoning my mother for weeks, using a combination of prescription medications stolen from the hospital pharmacy and other toxic substances designed to make her appear naturally ill. When she was finally admitted to the hospital, he simply continued the poisoning process under the cover of legitimate medical care, with the assistance of corrupted hospital staff who helped ensure that no questions would be asked. But as damning as this evidence was, I still faced a massive obstacle. The people responsible for my mother's death were prepared to go to extreme lengths to protect themselves. Gerald had money, connections, and allies who were just as guilty as he was. My investigation was threatening to expose not just a single murder, but an entire network of corruption and conspiracy that reached into respected institutions. The danger I was in became clear when Marcus called me one evening with urgency in his voice. "Harmony, you need to be very careful. I've been asking questions about Morrison and the hospital, and I've learned that Gerald knows about our investigation. Someone has been following me, and I think they might be watching you too. These people have killed once to protect their secrets, and they won't hesitate to kill again." That night, as I sat in my apartment reviewing all the evidence I had gathered, I realized that I had reached a turning point. I had enough information to understand how and why my mother had been murdered, but I was still far from being able to prove it in a court of law. The people responsible had power, resources, and a willingness to use violence to protect themselves. My mother had died because she had tried to stand up to Gerald, and now I was following in her footsteps. But I had one advantage that my mother hadn't possessed: I knew what I was fighting against. Gerald's web of lies and corruption was about to face the full force of a daughter's love and determination for justice. The question was whether I could expose the truth before they found a way to silence me permanently. By February, my investigation had reached a critical juncture where I was no longer just gathering evidence. I was actively threatening the freedom and security of multiple people who had participated in my mother's murder. Gerald's desperation was beginning to show, and the protective network around him was starting to take aggressive action to stop my pursuit of the truth. What I didn't realize at the time was how far they were prepared to go to silence me permanently. The first sign of escalation came through my father's financial pressure. Gerald had been making plans to sell the family home where I had grown up, claiming that maintaining the property was too expensive and emotionally difficult after my mother's death. But I knew the real reason: he needed immediate cash to pay off his gambling debts, and his loan sharks were becoming increasingly impatient with his delays. When I hired an attorney to challenge the sale of the house, arguing that my mother's estate had an interest in the property that needed to be properly settled. Gerald's response was swift and vicious. Within days, I received a letter from a law firm I had never heard of, claiming that I owed my father money for loans he had supposedly made to me over the years. The amount they claimed was substantial enough to force me into bankruptcy if I couldn't prove the loans were fabricated. The legal documents looked official and contained details about financial transactions that I had no memory of making. When I showed them to my attorney, he explained that someone with knowledge of my financial history and access to my personal information could have created false records that would be difficult to disprove without extensive investigation. Gerald was using his connections and resources to manufacture evidence against me, just as he had manufactured my mother's death to look natural. But the financial warfare was just the beginning. Gerald's next tactic was far more personal and designed to destroy my credibility with anyone who might believe my accusations against him. He began spreading stories throughout our community that I was suffering from a mental breakdown caused by grief over my mother's death. According to Gerald's version of events, I was creating elaborate conspiracy theories because I couldn't accept that my mother had died from natural causes. The effectiveness of Gerald's psychological campaign became apparent when several of my longtime friends and colleagues began treating me differently. Some avoided me entirely, while others approached me with the kind of gentle concern usually reserved for someone experiencing a serious mental health crisis. Gerald had positioned himself as the worried father trying to help his unstable daughter, while portraying my investigation as the delusions of a grieving mind. The most devastating betrayal came from my own family. My uncle Thomas, my mother's brother whom I had always considered an ally, called me to express his concerns about my behavior. Gerald had convinced him that I was harassing hospital staff, making false accusations against respected professionals, and wasting money on frivolous investigations. Thomas urged me to seek professional help and to stop dishonoring my mother's memory with unfounded conspiracy theories. "Gerald has been nothing but patient with you, Harmony," Thomas said during our painful phone conversation. "He's grieving too, but he's handling it with dignity while you're making wild accusations that are embarrassing the entire family. Your mother would be ashamed of the way you're behaving." Those words cut deeper than any physical injury could have, because I knew that my mother would have wanted me to fight for the truth, regardless of what anyone else thought. Gerald's campaign to isolate me from my support system was working perfectly. By portraying my investigation as a psychological breakdown, he was ensuring that any evidence I presented would be dismissed as the product of an unstable mind. Anyone who might have been willing to help me was now being warned that I was dangerous and delusional. I was becoming completely alone in my fight for justice. The situation became genuinely dangerous when Gerald enlisted the help of corrupt law enforcement. Detective Rodriguez, who had been assigned to handle any questions about my mother's death, contacted me to schedule an interview about my harassment of hospital staff. Rodriguez was a longtime friend of Frank Morrison's, and his approach to the interview made it clear that he was more interested in building a case against me than investigating my concerns about my mother's death. During our meeting, Rodriguez accused me of interfering with a closed case, harassing medical professionals, and making false statements about my father's character. He warned me that continuing my investigation could result in charges being filed against me for stalking, defamation, and obstruction of justice. The message was clear: back off, or face serious legal consequences. But Rodriguez's threats backfired in a way that neither he nor Gerald had anticipated. Instead of intimidating me into silence, his obvious bias and connection to the hospital administration confirmed that the corruption I was investigating extended into law enforcement. I now knew that I couldn't rely on official channels for help, but I also knew that my enemies were worried enough about my investigation to risk exposing their connections by threatening me directly. The most terrifying escalation came in the form of physical threats and attempts to harm me. My car's brake lines were cut while I was attending a meeting with Marcus Thompson, causing me to lose control of the vehicle on a busy highway. Only luck and my own quick reflexes prevented a serious accident that could easily have been fatal. When I reported the incident to police, they treated it as random vandalism rather than attempted murder. A few days later, someone broke into my apartment while I was at work, searching through my files and stealing several boxes of evidence I had been collecting. The burglary was professional and targeted, nothing of obvious value was taken except the documents related to my investigation. The police response was minimal, with officers suggesting that the break-in was probably the work of drug addicts looking for something to sell. The message being sent was unmistakable. I was completely vulnerable, my evidence could be destroyed at any time, and accidents could happen to people who asked too many questions. Gerald and his allies had escalated from financial pressure and social isolation to direct attempts to harm me physically. They were prepared to kill me just as they had killed my mother if I didn't abandon my pursuit of justice. The psychological pressure was becoming overwhelming. I was sleeping poorly, constantly looking over my shoulder, and beginning to question my own sanity despite knowing that my evidence was real and my suspicions were justified. Gerald's campaign to portray me as mentally unstable was working even on me, as the stress of fighting alone against such powerful opponents took its toll on my emotional and physical health. But the final straw came when Gerald made a direct threat against the one person I cared about more than my own safety. My younger sister Amanda, who was attending college in California. Gerald called me one evening with a tone of voice I had never heard before, cold and menacing in a way that left no doubt about his intentions. "You need to understand something, Harmony," he said quietly. "Your sister is very far away from home, very vulnerable, and accidents happen to college students all the time. Car accidents, drug overdoses, random violence. It would be terrible if something happened to Amanda because her sister couldn't learn to mind her own business." The line went dead, leaving me with the terrifying knowledge that Gerald was prepared to hurt an innocent young woman to protect his secrets. That night, I realized that my investigation had reached a point where continuing meant risking not only my own life but the life of someone I loved more than anything in the world. Gerald had successfully backed me into a corner where fighting for justice meant endangering the people I was trying to protect. For the first time since my mother's death, I seriously considered abandoning my pursuit of the truth and accepting that some crimes are too well protected to be exposed. I was at my lowest point, feeling utterly defeated by opponents who seemed to have unlimited resources and no moral boundaries. My mother's murderers appeared to have won, and I was running out of options to continue the fight without putting more innocent lives at risk. But sometimes when everything seems hopeless, help arrives from unexpected sources. I was about to discover that I wasn't as alone in this fight as Gerald had convinced me to believe. March brought the darkest period of my entire investigation, when Gerald's systematic campaign to destroy my life reached its devastating climax. I had lost my job, my family relationships were in ruins, my health was deteriorating from constant stress, and the threat against my sister Amanda hung over every decision I made. For the first time since my mother's death, I began seriously considering the possibility that Gerald might actually succeed in covering up his crime permanently. The job loss came first, executed with Gerald's characteristic precision and cruelty. He had used his business connections to spread word throughout my industry that I was experiencing a severe mental health crisis and had become unreliable and potentially dangerous. My employer, a marketing firm where I had worked successfully for 6 years, called me into a meeting under the pretense of discussing my recent absences and distracted performance. What I discovered was that Gerald had contacted my supervisor directly, claiming to be concerned about my psychological state and suggesting that I might pose a risk to myself or others if I remained in a high-stress work environment. He had provided detailed accounts of my delusional behavior, my obsession with conspiracy theories, and my harassment of respected community members. My supervisor, genuinely believing that she was protecting both me and the company, offered me an indefinite leave of absence for mental health treatment. When I tried to explain the truth about my investigation, my words only confirmed their worst fears about my mental state. The more I insisted that my father was a murderer and that there was a conspiracy involving the hospital, the more convinced they became that I needed professional help. Within a week, I was unemployed with a personnel file that would make finding another job nearly impossible. The financial pressure was immediate and crushing. Without income, I couldn't afford to pay Marcus Thompson to continue his investigation, couldn't hire attorneys to fight Gerald's legal maneuvers, and couldn't even maintain the basic living expenses that would allow me to continue my pursuit of justice. Gerald had calculated perfectly, understanding that desperate people make poor decisions and that poverty would force me to prioritize survival over my mother's memory. But the isolation was even worse than the financial stress. Gerald's campaign to portray me as mentally unstable had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. Friends who had known me for years began treating me with the careful politeness reserved for someone who might become violent without warning. Family members stopped returning my calls, convinced that engaging with me would only encourage my delusions and make my condition worse. The most painful betrayal came from my Aunt Patricia, my mother's sister, who had always been like a second mother to me. Patricia called to inform me that she was supporting Gerald's request to have me involuntarily committed for psychiatric evaluation. She genuinely believed that she was saving my life by forcing me to get the mental health treatment that she thought I desperately needed. "Your mother loved you so much, Harmony," Patricia said through tears during our final conversation. "She would want you to get well, not to destroy yourself with these horrible fantasies about Gerald. He's been so patient with you, so worried about your condition. Please let us help you before you hurt yourself or someone else." The involuntary commitment petition was the most terrifying legal document I had ever seen. Gerald had assembled testimonies from multiple family members, former colleagues, and even some of the hospital staff I had questioned, all expressing concern about my mental state and potential for dangerous behavior. The petition painted me as someone who had become progressively more unstable since my mother's death, fixated on conspiracy theories, and potentially violent toward the people I blamed for her death. I spent 3 days in a psychiatric facility, undergoing evaluations and trying to convince mental health professionals that my concerns about my mother's death were based on real evidence rather than grief-induced delusions. The psychiatrists were kind and professional, but they had been provided with Gerald's carefully constructed narrative about my behavior. Every piece of evidence I presented was interpreted through the lens of someone experiencing a psychological breakdown. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the psychiatrist assigned to my case, explained that it was common for people experiencing traumatic grief to develop elaborate theories about the causes of their loss. She showed me textbook examples of how intelligent, educated people could convince themselves that natural deaths were actually murders, especially when they felt guilty about not being present when their loved one died. "The evidence you presented is very detailed and shows how much thought you've put into this theory," Dr. Harper said gently. "But the pattern of thinking, the way you've interpreted normal events as sinister, and the way you've isolated yourself from people who care about you are all consistent with complicated grief disorder. With proper treatment and medication, you can learn to accept your mother's death and rebuild your relationships with your family." I was released after 3 days because I posed no immediate danger to myself or others, but the psychiatric evaluation became part of my permanent record. Any future attempt I might make to pursue legal action or present evidence about my mother's death would be undermined by the professional opinion that I was suffering from mental illness that caused me to fabricate conspiracy theories. Gerald's masterpiece of manipulation had succeeded completely. I was unemployed, isolated from my family, financially desperate, and now officially diagnosed with a mental condition that explained away all of my accusations against him. He had achieved what every criminal dreams of: complete discrediting of the primary witness to his crimes. During this period of despair, I made a discovery that nearly broke me completely. While searching through some of my mother's old papers that Gerald hadn't found and destroyed, I uncovered evidence that my mother had tried to warn me about her fears in the days before her death. She had written several letters to me, describing her suspicions about Gerald and her plans to leave him, but the letters had been intercepted before they could be mailed. Reading my mother's desperate words, knowing that she had been alone and terrified while I remained oblivious to her danger, filled me with a guilt that threatened to destroy my sanity in ways that Gerald's manipulation never could. She had been reaching out to me for help, and I had failed to receive her messages because Gerald had been controlling every aspect of her communication. In one particularly heartbreaking letter, my mother wrote, "Dearest Harmony, I'm writing this letter hoping that somehow you'll receive it even though Gerald monitors my phone and email constantly. I'm afraid he's trying to hurt me, and I don't know who else to trust. If something happens to me, please don't believe that it was natural. Gerald has debts and secrets that I've discovered, and I think he sees my death as his only solution. I love you more than life itself, and I need you to know that if I die, it won't be God's will or natural causes. It will be murder. Finding that letter was simultaneously the most devastating and most motivating moment of my entire investigation. My mother had known she was going to be killed, had tried to warn me, and had trusted me to seek justice if her fears came true. Every obstacle that Gerald had placed in my path, every lie he had told, and every person he had turned against me paled in comparison to my obligation to honor my mother's final request. But I was also realistic about my situation. I was alone, broke, discredited, and facing opponents who had demonstrated their willingness to use any tactic necessary to protect themselves. My sister Amanda was still at risk, my mental health was genuinely suffering from the prolonged stress, and I had no clear path forward that wouldn't end in either my own destruction or the harm of people I loved. That night, sitting in my empty apartment with my mother's letters spread across the table, I came closer to giving up than at any other point in my journey. Gerald had won through sheer ruthless efficiency, destroying my life so thoroughly that continuing to fight seemed impossible. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to accept defeat and try to rebuild some semblance of a normal existence. But as I held my mother's final letter, I realized that giving up would mean that Gerald's victory was complete. My mother would remain unavenged, her murderers would never face justice, and other potential victims would be left vulnerable to the same network of corruption that had killed her. I might be broken, discredited, and alone, but I was still alive, and as long as I was alive, I could continue fighting. I made a decision that night that would change everything. Instead of trying to work within a system that Gerald had corrupted, I would find a way to work around it. Instead of relying on people who had been turned against me, I would find new allies who had their own reasons to want justice. And instead of trying to prove my case through conventional legal channels, I would find unconventional ways to expose the truth that couldn't be suppressed or discredited. My mother had trusted me to seek justice for her murder. The little girl who had climbed into her lap for bedtime stories, the teenager who had called her for advice about everything, and the adult woman who had loved her more than anyone else in the world was still inside me somewhere, beneath all the damage that Gerald had inflicted. It was time to find that strength again and use it to honor the woman who had given me life, love, and purpose. The war wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning to be fought on terms that Gerald couldn't anticipate or control. April marked the turning point when I realized that my greatest strength lay not in fighting Gerald's network alone, but in discovering that he had created far more enemies than allies throughout his criminal career. My investigation had focused so intensely on proving my mother's murder that I had overlooked the possibility that Gerald had destroyed other lives and that some of his other victims might be willing to help me expose him. The first unexpected ally came from Gerald's own business world. Robert Kane, Gerald's former business partner, contacted me through an intermediary after learning about my investigation through the professional networks that Gerald had used to destroy my reputation. Robert had been suspicious about Gerald's financial practices for months before their partnership dissolved, and he had been quietly conducting his own investigation into Gerald's embezzlement activities. When we met at a small restaurant outside the city, Robert's story revealed the extent of Gerald's criminal operations and provided crucial evidence that I never could have obtained on my own. Gerald hadn't just been stealing money to fund his gambling addiction, he had been running sophisticated financial schemes that had defrauded multiple clients and business partners over several years. Gerald is one of the most dangerous people I've ever encountered, Robert explained as he showed me boxes of financial documents he had been accumulating. He has this ability to make everyone trust him completely while he systematically destroys their lives. He stole over $300,000 from our business, ruined relationships with our most important clients, and then convinced everyone that I was the problem when I started asking questions about missing money. Robert's evidence included bank records, forged contracts, and email communications that documented Gerald's theft with precision that would be admissible in criminal court. More importantly, Robert had discovered that Gerald had been targeting elderly clients and widows, using their trust and financial vulnerability to steal their life savings. My mother hadn't been Gerald's first victim, she had been part of a pattern of exploitation that stretched back years. But Robert offered more than just evidence of Gerald's financial crimes. He had also been investigating the network of corruption that protected Gerald's activities, and he had identified several other people who had been harmed by Gerald's schemes. Some of these victims had been afraid to come forward individually, but they might be willing to cooperate as part of a larger group seeking justice. The second crucial ally emerged from the medical community itself. Dr. Brooks, who had been forced into hiding after our previous conversations, reached out through a secure communication method to let me know that she had been conducting her own investigation into the hospital's corruption. She had discovered that my mother's death was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of suspicious deaths that had been covered up by the same network of administrators and corrupt staff. I've identified at least 6 other cases over the past 3 years where patients died under circumstances that should have triggered investigations, Dr. Brooks revealed during a carefully arranged meeting. In each case, Frank Morrison intervened to prevent autopsies, limit toxicology testing, or rush cremations before questions could be asked. The families were told their loved ones died from natural causes, but the medical evidence suggested otherwise. Dr. Brooks had been secretly documenting these cases, gathering medical records, and building relationships with other hospital staff who were concerned about the culture of corruption they were being forced to participate in. She had also identified the financial connections between the suspicious deaths and substantial insurance policies or inheritance situations that benefited surviving family members. "Your father's methods aren't original," she explained. "There's been a systematic operation using St. Mary's Hospital as a murder facility for people who want to eliminate family members or business partners. Morrison gets paid to facilitate the murders, corrupt staff members assist with the process, and the deaths are covered up through administrative pressure and destroyed evidence." This revelation transformed my understanding of what I was fighting against. Gerald wasn't just a desperate gambler who had killed his wife to solve his financial problems. He was part of an organized criminal operation that had been murdering people for profit and using a respected medical institution as their base of operations. The scope of the conspiracy was far larger and more dangerous than I had ever imagined. Dr. Brooks also provided me with contacts for other medical professionals who had been silenced or forced out of the hospital after questioning suspicious deaths. These doctors and nurses had been afraid to speak out individually, but they were willing to cooperate with a coordinated effort to expose the entire network. Their testimony would provide the medical expertise needed to prove that the deaths had been murders rather than natural causes. The third unexpected ally came from law enforcement itself. Agent Sarah Martinez, a federal investigator specializing in healthcare fraud, had been conducting her own investigation into financial irregularities at St. Mary's Hospital. Martinez had noticed patterns in insurance payouts, Medicare fraud, and suspicious administrative decisions that suggested organized criminal activity, but she had been unable to find witnesses willing to testify about what they had observed. When Martinez learned about my investigation through Robert Kane's contacts in the financial industry, she realized that my evidence might provide the missing pieces needed to build a federal case against the entire conspiracy. Healthcare fraud, insurance fraud, and organized murder for profit fell under federal jurisdiction, which meant that corrupt local officials like Detective Rodriguez couldn't interfere with the investigation. "Your mother's case might be the key to exposing an entire criminal enterprise," Martinez explained during our initial meeting. "But I need witnesses who can testify about what they observed, and I need evidence that will stand up in federal court. The people you've identified are exactly what I need to build a prosecution that can't be corrupted or covered up at the local level." Martinez's involvement changed everything about my situation. I was no longer a grieving daughter fighting alone against impossible odds. I was now a key witness in a federal criminal investigation with the full resources of the FBI behind my pursuit of justice. Gerald's network of local protection and corruption meant nothing when faced with federal agents who couldn't be bought, threatened, or manipulated. But perhaps the most important ally was someone much closer to home. My sister Amanda, who had been studying criminal justice in college, had been conducting her own research into our mother's death. Despite Gerald's threats and my own attempts to protect her by keeping her uninformed, Amanda had recognized that Gerald's behavior after our mother's death had been suspicious and inconsistent with genuine grief. Amanda had been using her access to legal databases and criminal justice resources to investigate Gerald's background, his financial situation, and his connections to the hospital. She had also been building relationships with other students and professors who could provide expertise in areas where my investigation had been limited by my lack of professional training. I knew Gerald was lying about something, Amanda told me when she flew home to join the investigation. His behavior never made sense for someone who had just lost his wife. He was too focused on practical matters, too quick to want to dispose of Mom's belongings, and too insistent that we accept her death without asking questions. I've been building a case against him from California, and I think I have evidence that even the local police can't ignore. Amanda's evidence focused on Gerald's psychology and behavior patterns rather than the medical and financial aspects that I had been pursuing. She had interviewed family friends, neighbors, and business associates who had observed Gerald's behavior before and after our mother's death. Their testimony painted a picture of a man who had been planning his wife's murder for months and had shown no genuine grief after her death. Having Amanda as an ally also solved one of my most pressing personal concerns. Gerald could no longer threaten her safety to control my behavior, because she was now an active participant in the investigation with her own protection from federal authorities. She was also able to provide emotional support and perspective that helped me maintain my sanity during the most difficult aspects of building our case. By the end of April, I had assembled a team of allies that Gerald could never have anticipated. A business partner seeking revenge for financial fraud, a network of medical professionals with evidence of multiple murders, federal agents with jurisdiction beyond local corruption, and my own sister with training in criminal investigation. The isolated, desperate woman that Gerald thought he had destroyed was now part of a coordinated effort to expose an entire criminal enterprise. Gerald had made a critical error in his strategy. By creating so many victims and relying on fear and intimidation to maintain his network, he had ensured that eventually someone would find a way to fight back effectively. His success in covering up my mother's murder had made him overconfident, and his escalation against me had forced me to find allies who were even more dangerous to him than I was alone. The investigation was no longer about proving one murder or satisfying one daughter's need for justice. It had become a federal case against organized crime that would expose corruption in medical institutions, financial fraud that had destroyed multiple lives, and a murder-for-hire scheme that had been operating with impunity for years. Gerald's perfect crime was about to become the foundation for his complete destruction. May brought the culmination of months of investigation, planning, and careful coordination between federal agents, medical professionals, business fraud investigators, and my own relentless pursuit of justice for my mother's murder. Agent Martinez had developed a comprehensive strategy to gather the final evidence needed for prosecution, which would require getting Gerald to incriminate himself in ways that couldn't be explained away or covered up by his network of corruption. The plan was elegantly simple and devastatingly effective. Gerald was facing increasing pressure from his loan sharks, who were demanding immediate payment of his gambling debts or threatening to take violent action against him. Agent Martinez had learned through financial surveillance that Gerald had until June 1 to provide full payment, or his creditors would consider him in default of their agreement. This deadline created the perfect opportunity to exploit Gerald's desperation. Through Robert Kane's connections in the business community, we arranged for Gerald to receive what appeared to be a legitimate business opportunity that would provide him with enough money to satisfy his debts and start over with a clean slate. The client was actually an undercover federal agent posing as a wealthy businessman who needed assistance with what he claimed were complex financial arrangements for an elderly family member who was terminally ill. Gerald's eagerness to accept this opportunity, despite having no legitimate qualifications for the work being offered, demonstrated his desperation and his willingness to engage in questionable activities for money. But more importantly, the undercover operation was designed to create situations where Gerald would reveal his knowledge of how to manipulate medical care, insurance policies, and administrative procedures to cause someone's death while avoiding legal consequences. The conversations were recorded with federal court authorization, ensuring that any admissions Gerald made would be admissible evidence in criminal prosecution. Agent Martinez had briefed the undercover agents extensively on the specific details of my mother's murder, so they knew exactly what questions to ask to get Gerald to explain his methods and reveal his connections to the corruption at St. Mary's Hospital. Meanwhile, Dr. Brooks and her network of allies within the medical community were working to gather additional evidence from the hospital's records and files. They had identified the specific medications that Gerald had used to poison my mother, traced how those substances had been obtained from the hospital pharmacy, and documented the administrative interference that had prevented proper investigation of her death. Angela Torres, the pharmacy technician who had been having an affair with Gerald, had agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Her testimony provided detailed information about how Gerald had obtained prescription medications, how he had learned about dangerous drug interactions, and how he had planned to use medical knowledge to commit murder without being detected. Gerald was obsessed with finding ways to kill people that would look natural, Angela revealed during her debriefing with federal agents. He would ask me questions about different medications, how they worked, what would happen if someone took too much or took them in combination with other drugs. At first, I thought he was just curious, but eventually I realized he was planning to use the information to hurt someone. Angela also provided evidence that Gerald's connection to the hospital corruption extended far beyond his relationship with her. She had observed meetings between Gerald, Frank Morrison, and other individuals who appeared to be coordinating systematic fraud and cover-up activities. These meetings had taken place in hospital administrative offices during non-business hours, and they had involved discussions about insurance policies, patient deaths, and methods for avoiding medical investigations. The breakthrough moment came when Gerald, believing he was speaking confidentially to a potential criminal partner, provided a detailed explanation of exactly how he had murdered my mother and covered up the crime. The undercover agent had convinced Gerald that they were planning to eliminate a similar target, and Gerald had volunteered to share his expertise to ensure the new murder would be equally successful. The key is controlling the medical environment, Gerald explained, unaware that his words were being recorded by federal agents. You need someone inside the hospital who can make sure the right medications are administered and the wrong questions aren't asked. Morrison has been perfect for that. He controls the administrative side, and he knows which medical staff can be trusted to follow orders without asking for explanations. Gerald went on to describe the specific drugs he had used to poison my mother, how he had obtained them through Angela's access to the pharmacy, and how he had convinced hospital staff to administer lethal combinations without recognizing what they were doing. He also revealed that my mother's death had been planned for months, with Gerald carefully studying her medical history and existing medications to ensure that the poisoning would cause symptoms that could be explained as natural progression of her existing health conditions. Catherine was actually the perfect victim, Gerald said with chilling casualness. She had some minor heart issues and stress-related problems that gave me the foundation I needed. I just had to exacerbate those conditions until they became fatal, and then make sure the death happened in a medical setting where Morrison could control the investigation. But the most damning revelation came when Gerald explained how the murder had been connected to a broader criminal enterprise. He revealed that he had paid Frank Morrison and other hospital staff substantial amounts of money to facilitate the murder and cover-up, and that this same network had been used by other people who needed to eliminate family members or business partners for financial gain. It's been a very profitable arrangement for everyone involved, Gerald continued. Morrison gets paid well for his cooperation, the medical staff get bonuses for keeping quiet, and people like me get a service that would be impossible to arrange anywhere else. The hospital provides the perfect cover because everyone expects people to die in hospitals, and the medical staff have legitimate reasons to be handling medications and making decisions about patient care. Gerald even revealed details about other murders that had been committed using the same methods, providing federal investigators with evidence of multiple homicides that local police had never investigated. His casual discussion of systematic murder for profit demonstrated that my mother's death had been part of an organized criminal enterprise rather than an isolated incident of domestic violence. The recorded conversations provided prosecutors with everything they needed to file charges for murder, conspiracy, healthcare fraud, insurance fraud, and racketeering under federal organized crime statutes. Gerald had implicated himself so thoroughly that no amount of legal maneuvering or corruption could prevent his conviction and imprisonment. But the investigation also revealed the final, most shocking betrayal that had made my mother's murder possible. Detective Rodriguez, who had been assigned to handle questions about my mother's death and had threatened me to stop my investigation, had been an active participant in the criminal conspiracy. Rodriguez had been paid to ensure that any suspicious deaths connected to the hospital would be classified as natural causes without proper investigation. Rodriguez was essential to the operation, Gerald explained to the undercover agents. We needed someone in law enforcement who could shut down any family members or medical professionals who started asking inconvenient questions. Rodriguez would classify deaths as natural causes, discourage autopsy requests, and make sure that any evidence disappeared before it could become a problem. This revelation explained why my own investigation had been met with such hostility from local law enforcement and why Rodriguez had been so eager to portray me as mentally unstable rather than investigating my concerns about my mother's death. He hadn't just been incompetent or biased, he had been actively protecting the people who had murdered my mother. The arrests began at dawn on June 10, with federal agents simultaneously taking Gerald, Frank Morrison, Angela Torres, Detective Rodriguez, and several other hospital staff members into custody. The coordination was perfect, preventing any of the conspirators from warning the others or destroying evidence before they could be apprehended. Gerald's arrest was particularly satisfying because he was taken into custody while meeting with his loan sharks, who had come to collect their money and had threatened to kill him if he couldn't pay. The federal agents arrived just as Gerald was being threatened with violence, providing him with a glimpse of what his life would have become if he hadn't been arrested for murder. The evidence seized during the arrests included financial records documenting payments between conspirators, medical records showing the pattern of suspicious deaths, recorded conversations proving the conspiracy, and physical evidence linking the defendants to specific murders including my mother's death. Agent Martinez called me personally to inform me that the arrests had been successful and that federal prosecutors were confident they had enough evidence to convict everyone involved in the conspiracy. Your mother's case broke open an entire criminal enterprise, she told me. Because of your determination to seek justice for her death, we've been able to stop a murder ring that would have continued killing innocent people indefinitely. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Dr. Brooks called to tell me that St. Mary's Hospital would be conducting a complete review of all suspicious deaths that had occurred during the period when the conspiracy was active. Families who had lost loved ones under questionable circumstances would finally get the investigations and answers they deserved, and the hospital would implement new oversight procedures to prevent similar corruption in the future. Gerald's perfect crime had not only been exposed but had become the foundation for justice that extended far beyond my mother's individual case. His network of corruption had been dismantled, his co-conspirators were facing federal prosecution, and the institutional failures that had enabled the murders were being addressed to protect future patients. My mother's death had not been in vain. Her murder had exposed a criminal enterprise and led to systemic changes that would protect other families from experiencing the same loss and betrayal that I had endured. Gerald had thought he was committing the perfect crime, but he had actually planted the seeds of his own destruction and the salvation of countless potential victims. September brought the conclusion of the legal proceedings that had consumed my life for nearly 10 months. Gerald, Frank Morrison, Detective Rodriguez, and 6 other conspirators had all been convicted on federal charges ranging from murder and conspiracy to healthcare fraud and racketeering. The sentences were substantial, with Gerald receiving life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to harm another innocent person. The trial had been emotionally exhausting, requiring me to testify about my mother's final weeks, the evidence I had gathered, and the systematic campaign Gerald had waged to discredit and silence me. But there was also profound satisfaction in watching the truth finally emerge in a forum where Gerald's lies and manipulation had no power. The federal prosecutors had presented such overwhelming evidence that the defense had been unable to create any reasonable doubt about the defendant's guilt. During his sentencing hearing, Gerald made a final attempt to portray himself as a victim of circumstances, claiming that his gambling addiction and financial desperation had driven him to make decisions he regretted. But his words rang hollow after months of evidence showing the calculated, methodical way he had planned my mother's murder and participated in a criminal enterprise that had killed multiple innocent people. The most meaningful moment of the entire trial came when the judge addressed Gerald directly before imposing his sentence. "Mr. Mitchell, you didn't just kill your wife," Judge Harrison stated firmly. "You betrayed the trust of medical institutions, corrupted law enforcement, and traumatized families who deserved to grieve their loved ones naturally rather than wondering if they had been murdered. Your actions represent a level of evil that demands the harshest punishment available under law." But the legal victory, while important for justice, was only the beginning of my healing process. The months of investigation, betrayal, and psychological warfare had left deep wounds that wouldn't be healed simply by seeing Gerald convicted. I needed to rebuild relationships that had been damaged by his manipulation, restore my mental and physical health, and find a way to honor my mother's memory while creating a meaningful future for myself. The process of reconnecting with family members who had been turned against me during the investigation was particularly challenging. My Uncle Thomas, Aunt Patricia, and several others who had supported Gerald's claims about my mental instability struggled to accept that they had been so completely deceived. Some were able to acknowledge their mistakes and rebuild our relationships, while others remained too embarrassed or defensive to admit they had been wrong. Amanda proved to be crucial in this healing process, serving as a bridge between me and family members who felt guilty about their treatment of me during the investigation. She helped them understand that Gerald's manipulation had been so sophisticated and systematic that their reactions were understandable, and that focusing on guilt and recrimination would only cause additional harm to everyone involved. Gerald was a master manipulator who fooled everyone, Amanda explained during a family gathering where we addressed the damage that had been done to our relationships. Harmony wasn't asking us to choose between her and Dad, she was trying to protect all of us from someone who had already killed one family member and might have been willing to kill others. We should be grateful that she had the courage to pursue the truth despite how much it cost her personally. The restoration of these family relationships was important, but I also realized that some relationships had been permanently changed by what we had all experienced. Trust that had been broken by months of suspicion and accusation couldn't be completely repaired, and some family members would always carry guilt about their failure to support me when I needed them most. I learned to accept that healing doesn't always mean returning to previous relationships, but sometimes means finding new ways to connect that acknowledge the harm that has been done. My professional life required complete reconstruction as well. The reputation damage that Gerald had inflicted through his systematic campaign to portray me as mentally unstable had made returning to my previous career in marketing impossible. But the skills I had developed during the investigation, combined with the contacts I had made in law enforcement and the legal community, opened doors to opportunities one had never previously considered. Agent Martinez offered me a position as a consultant with the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Division, helping to identify and investigate cases where medical institutions might be facilitating criminal activities. My experience navigating hospital bureaucracy, understanding medical records, and recognizing patterns of corruption made me uniquely qualified to assist with similar investigations. Dr. Brooks, who had been reinstated at the hospital after the conspiracy was exposed, also offered me opportunities to work with families who had concerns about suspicious deaths or medical malpractice. The combination of my investigative skills and my personal experience with healthcare corruption made me an effective advocate for families who were struggling to get answers about their loved ones' deaths. But perhaps the most meaningful work I found was with support groups for people who had lost family members to violence or suspicious circumstances. My experience with Gerald's systematic manipulation and the institutional failures that had enabled my mother's murder helped me provide guidance and perspective to others who were struggling with similar situations. The most important thing to understand is that seeking justice isn't just about punishing the people who harmed your loved ones, I would tell group members who were beginning their own difficult journeys. It's about honoring the memory of the people you've lost by refusing to let their deaths be meaningless. Every question you ask, every piece of evidence you gather, and every person you convince to listen might prevent someone else from experiencing the same loss. The work with other families also helped me understand that my mother's murder, while devastating to me personally, was part of a much larger pattern of violence and corruption that affects thousands of families every year. Healthcare fraud, elder abuse, domestic violence, and institutional corruption create opportunities for people like Gerald to commit crimes with impunity, relying on public trust in respected institutions to avoid detection and accountability. Through my advocacy work, I became involved in efforts to reform oversight procedures at medical facilities, improve training for law enforcement officers investigating suspicious deaths, and create support systems for family members who have concerns about how their loved ones died. These systemic changes felt like the most meaningful way to honor my mother's memory while potentially protecting other families from similar tragedies. A year after Gerald's conviction, I made my first visit to my mother's grave since her funeral. The simple headstone bearing her name and dates seemed inadequate to represent the vibrant, loving woman who had been stolen from her family by greed and evil. But as I sat beside her grave on a crisp October afternoon, I felt a sense of peace that had been missing from my life since that terrible Christmas Eve phone call. "I kept my promise, Mom," I said quietly, placing fresh flowers beside the headstone. "I found the truth about what happened to you, and I made sure that Gerald and everyone who helped him will never hurt anyone else. It took everything I had, and there were times I almost gave up, but I remembered what you taught me about fighting for what's right even when it's difficult." I realized as I sat there that my mother's death, while tragic and unjust, had led me to discover strengths and purposes that I might never have found otherwise. The investigation had revealed my ability to persist in the face of overwhelming obstacles, to build alliances with unlikely partners, and to fight effectively against corruption and evil. These were gifts that my mother had given me through her love and example, even in death. The greatest lesson I learned through this terrible journey was that truth has a power that lies and corruption cannot ultimately defeat. Gerald's network of deceit and manipulation had seemed impenetrable, protected by institutional authority and personal connections that should have made justice impossible. But truth has its own allies, and when enough people commit to seeking and speaking truth, even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises can be exposed and defeated. I also learned that healing from profound trauma requires finding ways to transform pain into purpose, grief into strength, and loss into service to others. My mother's murder had caused me unimaginable suffering, but it had also led me to work that makes a real difference in other people's lives and to relationships with fellow advocates who share my commitment to justice and healing. As I prepared to leave the cemetery that day, I realized that while Gerald had taken my mother's life, he had not succeeded in destroying her legacy or the love she had given to her family. The woman who had taught me to stand up for myself, to question authority when necessary, and to never accept injustice had provided me with everything I needed to seek justice for her death and to build a life dedicated to protecting others. Christmas Eve came again, marking 1 full year since the phone call that had changed my life forever. Instead of spending the evening alone with my grief as I had expected, I found myself surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by my mother's story: Amanda, who had become my closest ally and dearest friend, Agent Martinez, and other law enforcement professionals who continued to work on cases inspired by our investigation, Dr. Brooks, and medical professionals committed to preventing future corruption, and families who had found answers and justice because my mother's case had exposed the criminal network that had also harmed their loved ones. "Your mother's death saved lives," Amanda observed as we looked at photos from throughout our childhood, remembering the woman whose love had shaped us both. "If Gerald hadn't been stopped when he would have continued killing people, and the hospital conspiracy would have claimed many more victims. She didn't die in vain, and her legacy is all the people who are alive today because you refused to let her murder be covered up." The Christmas tree in my new apartment was decorated with ornaments that had belonged to my mother, including the ones I had been hanging when the hospital called that terrible night. But this year, they represented not just loss and grief, but also love that continues beyond death and justice that emerges even from the darkest tragedies. I want to leave you with a question that has guided my healing and my work. When faced with injustice, corruption, or evil that seems too powerful to fight, how can each of us find the courage to seek truth and demand accountability? My mother's story shows that even the most sophisticated criminal conspiracies can be exposed when people refuse to accept easy answers and persist in demanding justice. Please share this story with others who might be facing similar struggles, and let me know in the comments if you have experiences with suspicious deaths or institutional corruption that deserve investigation. Like and subscribe if you believe that truth and justice are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible to win. Thank you for joining me on this difficult journey, and remember that love, truth, and determination are more powerful than any criminal conspiracy. May you find peace in seeking justice, strength in speaking truth, and hope in the knowledge that even in our darkest moments, we are not alone in our fight against evil. And may you cherish the people you love while they are still with you, because tomorrow is never guaranteed, but the impact of our love and our fight for justice can last forever.